Welcome to work. I hope you know how.
Regal Barbecue was 150 employees. Building was made in 1956. Similar old brick buildings are found across Saskatchewan. We'll get into why the bricks have issues. The Occupational Health and Safety Committee has brought employee concerns up regarding the walls and possible asbestos containing materials leaking out of the walls. Walls in pretty poor condition. And this insulation we'll talk about later, but really it's kind of like it's still very flaky insulation. And as the building settles, like obviously no less decades of heavy use, a lot of the insulation comes down right to the bottom level. And then so if there's any breach or leak or the cracking, this insulation will come out. And kind of note, there is asbestos in this, so it's not very much, and it's not really airborne because it's locked in the matrix of the insulation, so it's like not probably flying or out. But it also brings up a question is like, what other surfaces have asbestos in this building? Because this obviously does, because we got tested. And then the state of the wall, over the years, there's holes in all the walls. Like people cut holes in the walls for various reasons, for wires or cables or different projects as the building got used. Regal Barbecue is not the original owner of this building, so a lot of stuff has been done. There are similar buildings, thinking the industrial park outside of downtown Regina, Sutherland in Saskatoon, some of the a little bit of industrial park that's just north of downtown in Saskatoon. A lot of the buildings are kind of this brick, like big bricks, and there's asbestos insulation inside. What should we do to fix this asbestos problem in the walls? Or is it a problem? So obviously this building's been around for decades and nothing's been fixed. So is it a problem or isn't it? So just going through, well, we could remove the asbestos out of the walls. It's not a problem anymore. Well, what training should we provide workers? What signage should we put up? We should probably make a map with where asbestos is in the building. Do we need to do annual air testing? You should clean up the spill that's of material that's laid on the floor. And then do we need respirators for staff? Like who needs to clean this up? What needs to be done? And then develop procedures for asbestos. Okay, so why I'm saying this is a wish list is often students will, in recommendations, will put something like this. This is not helpful. Like if you're doing this at a business, they will not be able to take action on that. Obviously, there's probably some stuff that needs to be done. And the big thing is what and why. Just the first one, does it actually need to be done? If it's contained in the wall, it actually does not need to be removed. This could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and probably will be more if the building gets knocked down and they put a new building on. This will get mitigated right up, like that'll be dealt with at that time. Otherwise, probably isn't an issue. So training, yes, some people probably need asbestos training, or like if you want to do all workers, because like people can just hit the wall with like a hammer or something and asbestos containing materials comes out. So you could train everyone. Like that's fine too, but you better say why. And then also like, do they have WHMIS? Do they even know about the dangers of chemicals? Like there's some factors there. And so really like when I'm marking assignments, this is kind of my, I don't know, say pet peeve, but like from working in industry, it just won't fly. Like if you're writing up a report and there's no justification, it really is hard for the company to take action. Like, why do you need to do this? And if it's like, that's why you need to use the course materials and the regulations for all of the courses in this program to come up with why, right? So I'm going to go into some backing on how to explain this stuff a bit better. So instead of doing a wish list, of just like some random ideas with no like valid reason, we'll get into that. Like Regal Barbecue, the plant manager probably is a mechanical engineer or a trades guy with some sort of business background. That's going to be a lot of the cases is going to be it's going to be an engineer with an MBA, or it's going to be an engineer that doesn't have an MBA, or it'll be a trades guy that climbed the ladder and now maybe has taken some business courses. Generally, how the people are trained in business school, and that's who you're communicating to. Because again, like I've had bosses while I've worked in safety that were HR professionals. So again, business school, accountants I've worked for facilities managers, and they had different backgrounds as well. And I worked for an accountant, and all of them kind of wanted the same process. Is what's our current state? What's the gap? And it's like, what do we need to do to get there? And then how do we do that? And then what's the desired state? So if you go back to the wish list, yeah, this is the desired state, but why? Like, why is this ideal? So there's no explanation for that. So it's really hard for somebody to, like, again, an example of asbestos removal, like this could cost $1 million. Like you need to justify why that is the desired state, or is it the desired state, right? So that's why it's important that you get in the habit in our program of using the regulations and best practice, whether it's CCOHS, America, OSHA, or whatever, is figuring out like, well, what do other people say? Like, because safety isn't a trade secret. Like a lot of it's government regulated, or even really big companies will share what they do in their safety program. So it's like the information's out there. Like you just saying like, we should do this. Well, why? Like that's the whole point of like the case studies, is trying to like, we give you enough detail that you should be like, figure out like the case study is the current state, and then you're figuring out what we need to do and how we do it, and where we want to go with your safety program. So this is going to be very similar for like most of the classes in the OHSP program at SAS Poly. It's going to be the same thing over and over again. So again, like where we're at is the case study, and then what's the desired state, and then your report really should be answering these two big questions: is like, what do we need to do to get there, and how do we do that? Also, like one question's kind of missing on here is why we're doing that, right? So like you gotta explain this to the person that's going to sign the check. And without doing that, it really goes back to being a wish list. Like why are you being paid as a professional safety person to come up with these solutions and not just somebody else? Like, why not just the plant manager come up with a random list of ideas? Well, like, especially if they're doing it in 5 minutes and just throwing out some random ideas, like why do they have to pay you? Right? Like they want a report with an actual solution, and then you implement the report after approval.
These reports you handed in, it's almost as if you have no business training at all. I don't know what this is supposed to be.
Well, I'm just trying to get ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. There's just no way that we could keep you on.
But I don't even really work here.
That's what makes this so difficult.
How do you go from the risk like getting fired because your wish list is not what the business manager wants, or to move on to like a plan? So I'm going to work through some of the regulations and talk about kind of like how to paraphrase it a little bit, and then also things that like we should be communicating in a written plan. So I'm not going to write the written plan out. I'm just going to talk about like what I'm looking for and how to look for this, and kind of start thinking about this plan instead of doing a wish list. Hold of they can't go in the roof area. Precautions to be taken for the protection of the worker from physical, chemical, or biological hazards. So again, asbestos would fall under this category, right? So that when people are at risk of coming in contact with this stuff, or any of the asbestos in the building. Keep in mind, like asbestos was commonly used as a fire retardant in the past, like before 1980s. Like asbestos was put in as a binding agent in tons and tons of different stuff, which we'll talk about in a bit. But so a lot of people don't know that asbestos is still the number one killer of workers in Canada, right? So like this is actual concern. So these are reasons for the training. So if someone's like, well, why do we need to train workers? Well, it's legally required. So how much will it cost? So I'm just going to use some real quick, like, as I say, bar math here, but there's 150 workers. The course is going to be about an hour. We have an average cost of $50 per hour. Every company is going to be different. This is very low. The real, like what I used in industry was more like $100 an hour because that's their fully loaded cost, right? Like that's their salary, benefits, and then the cost of them not doing whatever they did, right? Like they were supposed to do that that day, like make product for our company or clean or whatever they're supposed to do. So then the next thing is the human resources has to scan and file 150 tests. So that'll probably take them, I don't know, about 2 hours. Again, that'll probably cost the company $100. So the OHSP, the safety professional, will develop the internal course. It'll be based off the CCOHS and WorkSafe BC documents. So the reason why I picked WorkSafe BC is because WorkSafe BC is really good training, including the video at the end of this little presentation. And the developed internal course. So again, just average, like your cost is $50 an hour. Again, that's probably pretty low. And then the total cost of training at a minimum will be $7,800. Now, this isn't a check that's being written out. This is just an internal cost, right? Because workers are doing a training session instead of building products. So again, is that a good return on investment? So if people don't think your training's very good, they're going to think that the training sessions are a waste of money. Create a map after walls are tested. So you're going to have to get someone to come in and they're going to have to drill holes into the walls and then see what the insulation of the walls contains, whether or not it has asbestos. So I'm saying this is about ballpark quote. I remember I worked, and this is quite a few years ago now. A contractor come and test the walls, and then you're going to have to make a map. So a lot of companies, if you have an engineer on site, they'll probably already have a map in AutoCAD, and then you can just get them to modify it. If you're working at a smaller shop, they might not have a map, so you'll have to make it. In the fire course, I show how to use a map, make a map using Excel. And this is actually the map from that course. And then so what I did is just, I'm doing a map. Only some of the walls have asbestos in them. So you're probably wondering why the whole facility wouldn't have asbestos in the walls. This part of the building was probably added on at a later date. Like this was added on in the 80s or 90s or 2000s. So this material does not have asbestos. And this was probably the old outside wall that was probably removed. And then another wall, an internal wall was put in later. So really old buildings, they've been modified many, many times as they go on. So in the regulations, there's quite a bit of stuff about asbestos. Like I said, I'm not trying to talk your ear off, so I'm not going to go into like a ton of detail. I just went Control F in the regulations and typed in asbestos and start looking, right? So asbestos, you're supposed to identify where it is. So like as you're writing a report too, you don't need to copy paste the regulation. You can paraphrase into your own words. Paraphrasing means turning this document, which is like legalese, into something that may be more readable for the worker, right? More readable for the boss. Because if they wanted to, they could just look up the regulations themselves. So like you're trying to like filter it. So you're making a report that's fairly easy to read. So if you take a look at this, point 23-5.3 here, employer contractor shall immediately identify the presence of all materials likely to contain asbestos, so we do have to get it tested, is damaged or in poor repair, and is likely to release asbestos dust into the atmosphere. So from that photo, definitely material is leaking out of the wall, so we need to repair the walls, and then we also need to like have some signage up. Also, because there could be material leaking out, we should make sure there's not friable asbestos floating around. So we have to every year then have a contractor come and then test the air quality to make sure asbestos isn't leaking out of the attic. Because there's two different types of asbestos, right? There's stuff that's readily floats around in the air, and then there's stuff that's like locked into the tile or locked into the matrix using glue or concrete or something, right? So an employer contractor shall ensure the identification and assessment. So again, I'm just putting this like they need to identify which substances may have asbestos in it. So like, yes, it's required. So asbestos containing materials are clearly labeled as asbestos. So we need to have signs up going into the attic, and we need to have signs on the walls that there actually is this. The presence and location of asbestos containing materials are clearly indicated on a map or plan is readily available to workers. So again, we need a map. It's required by law. So how many signs do we have? They're about $25 per sign. There are 40 signs needed. How do I figure that out? Is just spacing them about, through the plant, and then having them on some entrance ways and also entrances into the upper areas. Install time about 4 hours to walk around and do it. So a loaded cost of signage is about $1,200. Vermiculite containing asbestos in walls. Do not puncture or drill into the walls. Asbestos surfaces. Every asbestos surface is kept in good condition. So obviously, all repairs and sealing necessary to prevent the breaking off asbestos or the release of asbestos dust from asbestos surfaces is done immediately. So we have a wall leaking the stuff out. So again, if a boss is like, well, why did you call someone in to fix it? Again, it's going to depend on your relationship with your boss. If you just do the stuff or you need approval every time, does this need to be done? Well, yes, the wall is, from the photo, if you recall, is in very poor condition. And then, yes, it needs to be fixed. So fixing the leaking wall, the worst section is 100 feet long. It's estimated that it'll take 2 workers 2 days to complete the infill and paint. So just real quick. So you have $50 an hour times 2 workers times 16 hours, right? So that's about the cost of that. 200 containers of silicone or whatever infill you're using, and then paint canisters is 900. So again, this is probably a pretty low estimate. When I put in estimates with my employer, I always tried to be over, so it wasn't a sticker shock of like, well, you said it would be 4,900 and it's actually 9,999. So like once the project starts, maybe it will take longer. Again, it's going to depend on your place of employment. If they just want a rough guideline or they want it to be exact, if they want it to be exact, you're better to overestimate it. So just real quick, this is the original picture. This is what it looks like after the workers have infilled it. So they've filled it in with sealant and then they've repainted the wall twice. So it looks much better and it's not going to leak out. So protective equipment is disposed of as asbestos waste after use. So workers can't reuse the same respirators. They can't reuse the same filters. Tyvek suits they have to get rid of. All that kind of stuff, right? Like you need to not maintain it or like maintain the stuff. So also, if you recall, we had to get rid of do an immediate cleanup. So the slide's actually in the wrong spot. But like Hub City contractors will call that the discovery material. And then when holes need to be cut into the walls, this will be the preferred contractor. And they came and cleaned it up that afternoon for $1,200. Could we have a worker do it? Yes, but none of our workers are trained in asbestos. So then it would be under the right to know that we haven't trained them. So because this was an immediate thing, we just closed off the area and then had a contractor do it. So some things that we need to do too, just going real quick, if our workers are going to work on this project of like fixing the wall, we're going to have, it would be a good idea, best practice, to refit test all of them, ensure that if the guys have beards, they can't do the project, right? You have to hire workers that are clean shaven. And then I always like to refit test eyeglasses at that time. And then again, this documentation has to go into the employees' files. So if you recall back to the previous slide, 2 slides ago, so once this Tyvek suit has been used for asbestos material, it has to be put into a special container. It's a good idea to have a container on site if your building has asbestos material in it to store stuff in case there might be asbestos contact, like a project I worked on. And the reason for this is we did have multiple issues with the walls getting hit by forklifts, or someone threw a hammer once and out, like not intentionally, but it flew out of their hands and hit the wall, and it started leaking then too, right? So it's kind of like just having the training and all that ahead of time was really good. And then having the drum ahead of time also, and then you can pay to have this disposed of when it's full. Respirators and fit eyeglasses must be fit tested. So our program actually offers a course on how to train people to do fit testing for respirators and eyeglasses. Yeah, so like you don't want to have workers working with asbestos material that aren't fit tested, right? So that's not legally required. So if you're not familiar with this process, you need to do fit testing. So the guys, this isn't the right respirator for this purpose, but any respirator has to be fit tested, and then they do a testing thing to make sure the person's seal is good, so they're not tasting the chemical. So for this, I'm going to need to buy a respirator fit testing helmet. So again, if I think this is through Uline, and this would be $605 for the first kit. So if I'm fit testing a bunch of people, I'm going to need more than one kit. If the company doesn't have respirators on site, which if they're doing welding, hopefully they have respirators on site, or you have a lot of work to do. But just as a ballpark thing, we're going to have to buy 4 respirator, silicone respirator, the P100 cartridges. So again, we'll need about $300 just for the maintenance team to fix that wall. Going back as well, do we have safe operating and structuring, safe operating procedure for respirators? And then do we have one for asbestos? So we have to write 2 different documents here. Of note, like I'm not going to read all this to you because this video would be like 2 days long. But like, again, just going through, working with any substance that may contain asbestos. Prior to work starting, a job hazard analysis must be completed and signed by the immediate supervisor and a member of the Occupational Health and Safety Committee. Okay, so the reason for this is then you're double checking that things are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Also, the Occupational Health and Safety Committee then is double checking what the company's doing. So it can't come back on the company later on like you didn't follow your own procedures. That is the justification, right? So why are we doing this stuff? Well, it sounds like a lot, but if you just go back to the wish list, why did you pick these items? Like the reader doesn't know. Why would they give you money? Like you can see how quickly this can become like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And like, is this one the first one we need to do? Like, is it the most logical thing? Can we actually afford to do it as a company? Where if we start doing the other stuff, and is it required? And the answer to that is no. As long as asbestos is contained, it does not need to be removed. But best practice would not have it in the workplace. But again, that's not the situation for a lot of companies that can't afford to remove it. And then so like we talked, I think, about almost all of these other ones and why they're required. So if a supervisor came and said, why do you need to do this? Like, John, why are you doing this stuff? Like, well, it's legally required. All of these steps are legally required. And this is how much it's going to cost to implement. So again, kind of went through the current state and then the gap analysis of what we need to do. And then the desired state is to be legally compliant. So That's another misunderstanding people have is, can you exceed the legal requirements? Yeah, it's the same as saying minimum wage, right? Like minimum wage is the lowest salary that a company has to pay you by law, more than that, right? So it's the same as a safety system. If you're not following the legal standard, then that must be at least met where you can actually exceed that, right? So like the case with respirators, like a company can say, like, we want you to wear respirators all the time in all situations. Like, I don't, most places would not do that, but like, can they exceed the legal standard? For sure, right? So like that's kind of the thought process. But like people are going to say that, like, well, why are you making people wear respirators like when they're filing documents in HR, right? As a ridiculous example. Well, then you're going to get pushback because your solution isn't actually like valid. Like there's no real reasoning from industry or from the regulations to require someone from HR to wear a respirator when they're filing the asbestos tests, right? So, I mean, that's a bit of a ridiculous example, but I'll be honest, like in martial law assignments, some of them aren't that much different than that. Like people are just throwing out random ideas instead of actually using the regulations and course materials to do the gap analysis. Okay, so that is part one of the video. I'm going to go part two, and I'll actually go through a training session, and this is like an example course. So go through Regal Barbecue's asbestos course. You're not really familiar with asbestos. This is a microscope blow up of what asbestos fibers look like. So they look like almost like pins. So once they go into the lungs, they can't get out short. It's like they embed themselves in the lungs. So kind of note, asbestos is well known. This little presentation, if you're not really familiar with like respiratory issues, will be very applicable to the assignment 2 in org behavior. Asbestos is a naturally occurring fiber in rock, so you actually can see it right in here. It's strong, flexible, and fire resistant. So most of the type of asbestos that was used was type, and the main purpose why a lot of asbestos was used was it was a good binding agent if you put it into like concrete, and then also like historically people were very concerned about building fires. Historically, that's what people were using asbestos for, was to prevent buildings from burning down. So all asbestos is in common. They're like hollow fibers, like from a distance, they kind of look like needles. In the past, it was used for many purposes. It was using as an insulation tool for pipes. It was used in roofing materials, so it was put into shingles. It was put into cement. It was put into drywall. So your home would have possibly this in almost every surface for that fire properties, and then also because it made material stronger in the put into the matrix. Vehicle brakes and clutches always had these too. So if you're working with older vehicles, they can have asbestos in them as well. So why was asbestos used? So it was a cheap, naturally occurring mineral, so they could just mine it. So there's a few big things that happened. San Francisco fire, 1851, destroyed as much as 3/4 of the city. Chicago fire destroyed thousands of homes and killed 300 people. So asbestos was used as an insulator, and it was fire resistant. So you can actually put like right on a blowtorch onto asbestos and it won't catch on fire. And then it was also used to strengthen drywall materials, cement, and concrete. So it had multiple purposes. They used it in so many different products that if you're in an older building like Regal Barbecue's production building, it's almost in every surface. So who was most at risk? So people that did installs, it's like people that installed asbestos materials, that were asbestos miners. So there's actually a town in Quebec called Asbestos, and that was their main industry, and people didn't live that long. The other thing was in the old days, wives of miners and guys that did installs also would die from asbestos exposures because they would wash the clothes, right? Like handling the clothes. So think back to the pre-1950s, a lot of people didn't have like a washing machine, so they had to manually wash the clothes, and then they were breathing those fibers in when they washed the clothes. So this is from WorkSafe BC, and which is a lot of this materials was taken from WorkSafe BC. But just as a public health thing, if you live in a house that's like was built before 1990, there's a strong chance that a lot of the materials in the house have asbestos in them. So definitely, if you're doing a renovation on an older home, wear a respirator to ensure you're not breathing in these fibers. And then also so some countries are still using asbestos. So Canada was still exporting asbestos to a bunch of different countries for insulation and other purposes until fairly recently. And then it can be found safe to work around if the product's in good condition. So again, earlier, the pictures from the walls, obviously those walls were not in good condition. So you do not need to do abatement necessarily, right? Like, so if your first solution on the wish list was let's remove all the asbestos, well, you actually legally don't have to do that as long as the asbestos is not entering the atmosphere and it's not being disturbed. So routes of exposure: when crushed, asbestos splits up into tiny fibers. On inhalation, the needle-like fibers enter the body tissues. They accumulate in the airways and lungs. And then what happens is there can be scarring because the body can't get rid of these fibers. The body starts trying to protect itself, and then it develops scarring. This can also happen with silicosis, right? Is the other disease from silica in the or behavior course. So routes of exposure: airborne asbestos settles onto food. So like if you've worked in factories or construction sites, people eat on the job site often. They'll just eat as they're working, or they'll not want to eat in the lunchroom for whatever reason. And then they have this product on their food. Smokers or guys that do chewing tobacco, they can end up putting asbestos or other products into their mouths as they do the product. And then obviously it's in the mouth, it's in your esophagus and then stomach. Deaths in Canada. Asbestos is the leading cause of workplace-related death in Canada. It's estimated that over 2,000 people die every year from diseases caused by asbestos exposure. My grandfather died from asbestos-related things. He was a plumber, so he installed asbestos covers onto pipes, and yeah, like his death was horrible. It was very long and painful, and it lasted better part of a decade, like where he could barely breathe, and then he finally succumbed to mesothelioma, which is a cancer that you'll really only get from the exposure to asbestos. So the esophagus, the tube that goes down from your mouth, your stomach, can get cancer. Your larynx, mouth, stomach, your colon, so in your intestines, kidneys, and liver. So all those organs that either like clean the blood or involved in food or breathing can develop cancer. Asbestos diseases, this is often the issue you have with explaining long-term diseases to people, especially young men. They'll be like, well, I'm not concerned about that. Like, I'm a party guy. I'll be dead by then. But what? Statistically, you won't be, right? So no early warning signs. Like if you're exposed to asbestos, it's not like you're going home and coughing up a lung unless like you were breathing tons and tons of it that day. So it's like you really are years and years and years later is when you get sick from asbestos, right? So it's like in this case, it's like the latency period is almost 50 years after the fact. One thing I was just going to throw out too is I did not use APA when I made this presentation because like in industrial situation that I worked in, I didn't have to use referencing. I just could screenshot and summarize whatever I wanted to kind of. So that's a bit different. In a college, you do have to reference. So a person's affected, we'll just go through this. It's what type of asbestos is it? So again, is it friable or is it locked in the matrix? How often were you exposed to the asbestos? So like obviously a miner or a guy that did installs of insulation would be exposed to a lot. how much asbestos was in the air, and then how many times it occurred. So all of those effects. So any kind of thing like if you haven't done the industrial hygiene courses are going to go into like a ton of detail about this stuff. So breathing it in, person inhales microscopic asbestos fibers that get trapped in the lungs or chest cavity. The longer the exposure, the greater the concentration of fibers. And then therefore, the more likely there's going to be health problems. So again, asbestos is a disease that's only from being exposed to asbestos. Mesothelioma is a type of cancer, and then lung cancer, obviously, is that. And then you can have things stacked. So if you're a smoker and you work with asbestos-related products, you're way more likely to get lung cancer, right? Because your lungs are already agitated from the smoking, and then exposed to yet another thing. So asbestosis can take 10 to 20 years to develop. It's not a type of cancer. It's actually scarring of the lungs. So it disables the lungs and eventually can kill you. So it's a cough that won't go away. So you just coughed. I wasn't trying to be ironic there. Dry cackling sound in the lungs when breathing. So like that kind of sound. It's hard to want to eat when you're in that pain. So it's really hard to breathe. It's almost like you're asthmatic, never ending coughing, tightness in the chest, and then chest pain. So like I said before, this is kind of relevant. And the fact there's other diseases, like in the work behavior course, the silicosis would be kind of similar to this, right? It's the scarring of the lungs from silica rather than asbestos. And then mesothelioma, it's a rare type of cancer. It develops on the pleural lining around the lungs, shortness of breath, unexplained weight loss, pain under the ribs, painful swelling or lumps in the abdomen. So this is actually what my grandfather died of. So you just take a normal lung, so it's nice and pink and healthy. Heavy asbestos exposure, so it's like this. You see the scarring, like there's black in there, holes, and then you see mesothelioma affected lungs, so it's like the black cancer in there. Steve McQueen actually died of this, and he was like the king of cool. He was in a lot of movies in the 60s and 70s, and they used asbestos as fake snow in the 40s and 50s, 60s. So if you look at any of the old Christmas movies, that's what they look. So then lung cancer can develop, including getting cancer in the throat, trachea, and lungs. Symptoms of the lung cancer is coughing of blood, hoarseness, wheezing or shortness of breath, chest pain that doesn't ever go away. Often swollen lymph nodes can happen too if the cancer spread to your lymph nodes. Asbestos identifications, especially in the old buildings, suspected asbestos-containing materials have to, it's kind of weird, and they have to label things that don't have asbestos. So in old buildings, everything that doesn't have asbestos has to also be labeled that it doesn't, because then you have to treat everything like it has asbestos. Because if you remember that picture with the WorkSafe BC, almost everything in older buildings could contain asbestos. So asbestos fibers mixed with other materials form a matrix. So this is kind of like what's going on with the material from the walls that's leaking out. Like it's not really friable materials. It's actually locked in the building materials. So kind of like what happens is there's asbestos, and then there could be vinyl, tar, epoxy, plant fiber, rubber, paint, and cement all mixed in together. So this stuff shouldn't be really airborne because it's in the glue. Handling material. All material that is thought to contain asbestos should be treated as though it does. So until it's tested, you have to treat it like it does have asbestos. So you can't tell if a material contains asbestos just by looking at it, because they put it into so many different materials. Asbestos can be different colors. They can look the same. So like concrete looks the same whether it has asbestos or doesn't, as an example, or tiles will look the same. Same manufacturer might make tiles with and without asbestos in the 1950s. The only way to know for sure is by testing it in a certified lab. So there's certain careers where you're more likely to be have asbestos containing material. So in construction, obviously you're doing renos of old buildings, you'll come in contact. Even just the dust when the building gets knocked down. Maintenance work. So like I've already talked about it, like having this wall repaired would be under that category. Custodial work. So something breaks, something's leaking down. We'll get the janitor to fix it, and then they're exposed to asbestos. And then again, because of the auto body work, can be exposed to asbestos as well. Again, working with asbestos is generally safe as long as the building is being maintained. So again, here's another brick example of the insulation coming out. Exposure avoidance. The building owner has to post signs of where it is. They're supposed to post signs at the entrance of the building to make sure people coming into the building, like tradespeople coming in the building, know that there's asbestos in the walls. And then you're supposed to have labeling on the walls also to alert occupants. So if they're going to put a hole in the wall or if there's an accident and the wall's breached, they know not to touch the materials. So I know where it can be found. Buildings constructed before 1980 are way more likely to contain asbestos. Again, they're commonly found in roofing, shingles, flooring, hot water pipes, spray-on coatings, insulation of popcorn ceilings. Should be marked and labeled if it does not contain asbestos. So again, this pipe does not have asbestos, so you need to put asbestos free on there. So again, friable asbestos, which I've talked about earlier in the presentation, means that the material can become airborne at any time. Should be clearly marked as friable. Material that being crushed or crumbled is this. An example is a spray-on fireproof coating material. So again, it's really crumbly kind of stuff is often what comes to mind. So asbestos can come up in the air. So 0.5% asbestos is considered hazardous. Going back over the vermiculite insulation containing asbestos. So it's that silvery, goldy color that was coming out of the hole there. So the plant walls contains asbestos. This stuff is safe as long as the wall isn't disturbed. So like if the wall is contained, material is not coming out. It's fine. So you don't need abatement and like all the asbestos removed if it's contained. Non-friable asbestos, it's locked in the material. It takes a lot of abrasion to get this material out. So again, like if it's in concrete or tiles, you have to actually cut the material, then that would be a non-friable surface. Like it doesn't just easily come out into the air. Must treat these materials carefully to avoid releasing fibers into the air. Does not pose a health hazard when intact and undisturbed. So again, like you're not really concerned about testing air quality because unless somebody is grinding or cutting these tiles, they're not coming out into the atmosphere. 1% asbestos content is considered hazardous if it's a non-friable surface. Removing or replacing this at the workplace. Professionally trained abatement workers are to be called in to remove or replace asbestos-containing materials. Must use enclosures or glove bags to contain work areas. Signs must be posted outside regulated areas to keep unprotected people out while people are doing work with asbestos. This must be done for a large breach of materials, like what's happened with the stuff coming out of the walls. Don't disturb asbestos-containing materials. Untrained workers should never do the following: drill, hammer into the walls, cut or break the materials, damage or move or handle asbestos-containing materials. So again, fiber releasing sources. So any of this stuff actually has asbestos and it's getting blown around, it would be really bad. So exposure to elements, again, like buildings can degrade over time. Impact from other objects, like I said, the one worker threw a hammer and hit the wall. Vibration can also cause, you think about big forklifts moving big products, like shipping containers filled with barbecues could cause material to drip down. Fans and blowers then could spread the asbestos out. And then again, if there's a chemical leak or fumes, that they could damage the wall and then release materials that way. So never hang anything from insulated pipes. So people like hanging signs from insulated pipes, and then as the sign blows, it starts shaking the friable materials out of the pipes. Never drill holes or hammer nails into walls or ceilings, especially in older buildings. Don't scrape floorings, walls, or ducts while moving furniture. Don't remove ceiling tiles or light fixtures. Keep warning labels on ACM products, like asbestos-containing materials. Don't dust moldings or asbestos-containing surfaces. So keep all surfaces free of dust and debris, so then people aren't doing that. Never clean surfaces with compressed air. So again, that compressed air is going to throw it out all over the surface. Use a HEPA vacuum to clean this up, so when it gets sucked in. Fiber release prevention. Prevent airborne fibers from re-entering the workplace. Wet asbestos containing debris before cleaning it up. So then when asbestos materials are wet, they can't enter the air because they're damp. Never shovel, dry sweep, or use any other dry cleanup methods that you often use for chemicals. Never sand or scrape vinyl flooring. Strip floor finishes only with wet methods, so it's not causing the tiles to become airborne. Never burnish or dry buff asbestos containing flooring. Responding to a lease. Release of asbestos fibers can range from small to large. Examples like you have broken tiles, a large area of spray on asbestos containing insulated is disturbed. So again, if you have a wall breach, or if the roof is breached and the roof insulation, which contains asbestos, comes down, that could also be a huge release. With a minor release, get everyone out of the area immediately. Tell a supervisor, put on PPE if you're trained. Shut doors and barricade the area. Turn off the ventilation systems. Supervisor will fill an incident report, wet the material, HEPA vacuum material, and dispose, which we already talked about. There's an oil drum for this. And dispose of the clothes and the gloves. And the filter cartridges for the respirator. Use proper hygiene and clean the body. Cutting, trimmings, or reject materials have to go in that oil drum. Housekeeping waste resolved from wet sweeping or vacuuming needs to go in that oil drum, and then wet with water, a mixture of water, and so that keeps it from becoming airborne. Place in disposable containers, which is that oil drum. Never attempt any emergency response to a fiber release, unless you are assigned by Regal Barbecue, fully trained and equipped for the job. So again, we don't want to have random people going into Regal Barbecue's asbestos walls. Older buildings most likely have asbestos in them. They should be treated that way unless otherwise proven. The asbestos content in our walls was tested, and it was 1 to 4%. So what was the dangerous level? If you recall, so it was, if it's over 1%, it's considered dangerous, right? So the material on our walls is considered dangerous. So containing unreleased material, again, saturate the material with water, clean up the area, place debris in a leak-proof container, that plastic oil drum, label the container asbestos materials, use paint and other sealants to seal the wall. Housekeeping materials, spray vacuum bags with a fine mist of water and surfactant so it doesn't become airborne. Place the wet debris in well-labeled container. Never try to clean and reuse bags. From major release, restrict entry into the area. Post signs of why the area is closed so people don't just walk through. Shut off or modify the air handling system. And then contract the contractor to book a cleanup. So you don't want to have our workers going in that. So about regulated areas, so there's going to be signage that you can't go into certain areas. We'll have to have a control strategy for what kind of work is going on there, and then there has to be corrective actions taken. Don't use lunchrooms wearing work clothes or PPE because you're going to spread the asbestos material around. Use the HEPA vacuum to remove surface asbestos from clothing. So this is kind of the opposite of using pressurized air. So you're actually sucking the contamination into the HEPA vacuum off the clothes before you dispose of both. Change area. At the end of the shift, return to the clean change area to put your street clothes on. Don't put on any contaminated clothes because if you remember from earlier in the presentation, You can bring this home to your significant other or children if you're wearing asbestos containing clothing. Never leave work wearing PPE. So you don't want to have your glasses on or a respirator or even your work boots. You want to bring them back home. And then thoroughly shower hair and any exposed skin. Recommend showering at work. So again, you're not bringing that stuff home. Change area. Take home undergarments worn during the shift and wash them thoroughly. Don't take home asbestos contaminated clothes to be laundered. So like those will be disposed of, or contaminated clothes can be also professionally laundered. Hooded protective DuPont white tie-back suits are what are required. So your work clothes really shouldn't come into contact with materials because you're wearing the tie-back suit. Work clothing standards. So we need you to have a respirator. You need to be fit tested with a respirator, safety glasses, and we have to fit test the safety glasses as well. And then a tie-back suit. Respirator capabilities. We have to have a good seal. So again, the fit testing has to be done. For greater exposure, you actually have to have supplied air. So this would be the same as the case for silica, is that if you're working in a place where you're under constant exposure or very high exposure, you have to have supplied air. Exemption from respirator use. If recent medical exam shows that a respirator would affect your health or coworkers, you'll be assigned other jobs because you can't work with asbestos and not have a respirator. So Ken, you need the full tie-back suit. You need work shows or disposal covers for this, gloves, full face respirator, and face shield or vented goggles. And we want you not to wear this PPE when you're doing other jobs. So it's just asbestos related materials. So air monitoring, the employer performs yearly inspections of areas containing asbestos to ensure containment, to make sure there's not asbestos in the air. So safe work practices, as seen earlier in the presentation, we already have a safe operating procedure for respirators, but we don't have a specific one for asbestos yet. So we'll have to develop that based off the regulations part 23, health and safety in Saskatchewan. So again, all workers have the right to know the risk from asbestos. We have to all share the responsibility to minimize the risk by ensuring asbestos material stays contained in the walls, and then know your hazards, protect yourself, and follow the rules. Working in a building that contains asbestos is generally safe. You don't need to have abatement done and remove all the asbestos. If materials are damaged, disturbed, the risk being exposed to asbestos greatly increases, right? So if walls are being damaged, then you're going to be exposed to asbestos materials. Protect yourself by knowing where asbestos-containing materials can be found, where to look. Never to disturb materials thought to contain asbestos. And really, in our building, we won't. Most of the surfaces in the older building could contain asbestos. Summary, talk to your supervisor if you're unsure about a material. Know what to do when asbestos fibers are released into the air. Your quick actions could keep you and your coworkers safe. For this presentation, I'm not going to play the video, but I can put a link in the news. This is actually a WorkSafe BC video for asbestos. In this context, there's a short quiz, usually 10 to 20 questions long, based off of this material, and then that gets filed in employees' files as proof of the training. Done. Thanks.